Well, the first message from Powell was, to be fairly honest, a little bit surprising. No, on the one hand, Mr. Powell continues to provide the message of transitory inflation, but now he uses the words largely transitory, which means that a lot of prices are going to remain elevated for a long period of time. The other problem is that he also mentions that inflation is going to run higher for longer. So transitory means we don't know. We don't know how much it means. And it's important to understand this. Why? Because the last CPI print, the last headline inflation print that we have seen, was already a month without base effect, and in which, despite rising in most of the prices, there was not yet a very aggressive impact from the elements that have to do with housing and shelter, and that's about 24% of CPI. So that means that shelter is going to increase inflation in the next months, and that we need to pay a lot of attention to it.
Jerome Powell, though, he is putting most of it down to supply chain issues, I believe, that he thinks will resolve themselves over the next 6 to 12 months. What's your assessment on that?
Well, the argument of supply chain disruptions is easily debunked. We have seen commodities in which there is a massive level of oversupply going up 22% year on year. So, and we see, for example, that the index of food prices in many agricultural commodities where there's absolutely no problem of supply chain disruptions, remain extremely elevated. So I think that it's a bit of an excuse, to be fairly honest, because you can understand that there were some supply chain disruptions in the first uh, part of the reopening that is already almost a year away from us. You can say that there might be some of it in one or two commodities, but we're seeing it everywhere. If you look at all of the components of inflation, you have an increase in inflation in components that in which there is absolutely no problem in any shape or form in terms of supply chains.
A lot of people who watch Powell are, well, one person who was at the meeting asked a question about housing prices here in the United States. Does the Fed have any role to play in rising housing prices? Powell addressed it. He said, well, prices are definitely rising, but a lot of people online are criticizing or putting the blame on the Fed's doorstep for their purchases of mortgage-backed securities since the pandemic hit. How exactly does that impact the price of houses here?
It's very simple. If we look at what drives the housing market, there are two things. One is obviously that if people are wealthier and they're purchasing more homes with lower mortgages or with a higher percentage of capital, that definitely leads prices higher. The supply of housing also leads to, if there's an increase in demand, leads to more tightness in the market, particularly in the areas everybody can understand where there is high demand. No? But there is another important effect, and you just mentioned it, which is if the housing market is strong, if demand is strong and supply is acceptable, why on earth does the Federal Reserve have to buy mortgage-backed securities, which is, in essence, keeping the housing market hot when demand and supply are already working their way out. So it's basically inflating prices in a sort of secondary way. Because why would you need to do that? Those mortgage-backed securities would be hugely bought and sold in the market without any problem if the solvency and the strength of the housing market was as we see it. No, therefore, what the Fed does by buying mortgage-backed securities is incentivizing banks to lend more aggressively. Second, it is keeping the house prices at an elevated level, even in the areas where demand is not that high.
What would happen if it stopped buying them?
Well, this is the thing, no? This is the thing. If we listen to the Fed officials, they say, well, the housing market is very strong, so there would be no problem. Phenomenal. Stop buying them. This is what I find almost dishonest in the argument all the time. If Fed officials and central bank officials say that the reason why the housing market is strong is because of fundamental supply and demand, and the reason why bond yields are low is because of ample demand for sovereign bonds. Stop purchasing them. It's very simple. Then we will see. But my guess is that if they stopped buying mortgage backed securities and they stopped purchasing sovereign bonds, we would see bond yields rising and mortgage backed securities valuations fall. If the Federal Reserve purchases those mortgage backed securities, what it is inevitably doing is making the market believe artificially that the low quality mortgages and the high quality mortgages are exactly the same. So you are not seeing the level of real risk that the housing market is taking. What basically the Fed is doing by purchasing mortgage backed securities is eliminating the forces of the market in housing, which is what matters the most for the vast majority of citizens.
We see a lot of people, they point to treasury yields and they say, well, the market isn't pricing it in. The market is saying it's transitory. But do you feel it is just because the Fed are buying these bonds that
Yeah.
the rate is so low?
Yeah, it makes no sense. The bond market is not reflecting inflationary pressures the same way that the steepening of the yield curve doesn't indicate recession anymore. Why? Because the central bank is purchasing 100% of the net issuances of the Treasury. So it makes absolutely no sense to believe that the bond market is sort of a reflection of inflationary pressures because it isn't. And if it had been, you would not have seen bond yields move the way that they have. Why? Because the central bank purchases more bonds. So when the central bank is 100% of the net issuances of a sovereign country, there you cannot imply that the yield of the bond is saying anything about the solvency, the liquidity, or the inflation risk of a country. In the same way, look at it this way. If you look at the bond yields in Greece or in Portugal or in Spain, they're at negative real levels. No? There are negative real levels. Does that mean that any of those countries, France, Italy, you name it, are more solvent, are stronger, are doing better? No. It means that the central bank is purchasing them.
Daniel.
Thank you for watching this video. Please subscribe to my channel, like my videos, leave your comments below, and keep defending freedom. Thank you very much.